Did you know since the 1970s, the Oxford English Dictionary has credited fantasy author J.R.R. Tolkien with the invention of the word hobbit? We'll discuss this and other interesting facts about fantasy adventure stories with author J.V. Hilliard on this episode of The Curious Professor. Hi everyone, I'm Dr. B. Welcome to the Curious Professor podcast, where I take listeners on a journey of discovery to explore the people, places, artifacts, and natural wonders that spark my curiosity. On this episode of the Curious Professor podcast, we'll explore the story behind the stories with fantasy author J.V. Hilliard. But first, a trivia question. When was the first Dungeons & Dragons set produced? I'll have the answer for you at the end of this episode. I'm thrilled to have J.V. Hilliard on the show today. According to J.V., he was born of steel and fire and black wind, and was raised as a Highlander in the foothills of a once great mountain chain, on the confluence of three mighty rivers that forged his realm's wealth and power for generations. His father, a peasant twerg, toiled away in industries of honest labor, and instilled in him a work ethic that would shape his destiny. His mother, a local healer, cared for his elders, and his warrior uncle, who helped to raise Hilliard during his formative years. His genius brother, whose wizardly prowess allowed him to master the art of the abacus and his own quill, trained with him for battles on fields of green and sheets of ice. Hilliard's earliest education took place in his warrior uncle's tower, where he learned his first words. His uncle helped him to learn the basics of life, and most importantly, creative writing. Hilliard's training and education readied him to lift a quill that would scribe the tale of the realm of Warminster, filled with brave knights, harrowing adventure, and legendary struggles. He lives in the city of silver cups, hypocycloids, and golden triangles, with his wife, a ranger of the diamond. They built their castle not far into the countryside, guarded by his own two horsehounds, Thor and MacLeod, and reside there to this day. Welcome to the show, JV. It's great to have you here.
My pleasure. Thanks very much for having me today.
What's the most unique thing about you?
So I didn't start out my career as an author. I started out my career as a DC lobbyist. I do technology and defense lobbying for companies that are trying to access the government marketplace. So my day job is filled with realism, and if you asked anybody at my day job that if I wrote a book, they would say, well, what kind is it? A historical fiction, or is it an autobiography, or a biography on somebody? And if I said fantasy adventure, they would fall off their seats. It's just not what I do. And so I think I have a very unique and interesting perspective. And I try to use my day job, some of the experiences I've had in not only in politics, but also in sort of like the industries in which I work, to advance various things within the novels that I write. And it helps, I think, create a better story. So I know that that might not be the typical fantasy adventure author or epic fantasy author background. So I think that might be the most unique. I think I have the most unique perspective on the genre, I think, from that perspective.
And
yes.
It's definitely a unique entry into being a fiction author as well.
Yeah, I had, when COVID happened, I had nothing to do. DC was shut down, government was closed. I wasn't going anywhere for a year and a half. And I've always had this in the back of my mind, rattling around as to something that I wanted to do. And I use my writing as escapism, right? And I've always been a fan of things that take me away from the real world. Because I mentioned earlier, I do real world stuff every day. So for me to be writing through the eyes of an elf or a magical creature or whatever really kind of, brings me back to a simpler time in my life. And when, you were looking for a silver lining in a very dark cloud, my wife was like, why don't you give it a shot? It's something you've always talked about doing. And I had no perspective. I didn't know what I was going to do. And I ended up writing a draft manuscript that I shared with a professor friend of mine. And she read it and said, there's something here. You need to work on your dialogue and some pacing. and things like that. But find a development editor, find a copy editor, and they'll put something together. And eventually it ended up getting published a year later. And now I'm on, book 3, on my way to the final book 4, in the series sometime in the summer. So it's cruising now. It's almost like, if you ask me what I do, I don't say I'm a lobbyist anymore. I say I'm an author.
So tell us about your Warminster series.
Sure. So it's set in a standard fantasy realm, but it's one that I've world built myself, right? So if you're a fan of Middle Earth and the Tolkien stuff from Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit, or more adult fantasy stuff that you find with Sanderson or Martin or Terry Brooks or even Salvatore and Margaret Weiss, I think you'll find, they held their own realms, so I'm not Westeros, I'm not Middle Earth, I am Warminster, right? And so Warminster is set in, sort of a standard medieval fantasy sword and sorcery kind of realm where there's dragons and magical creatures and monsters and that kind of mysticism that goes along with it. But at the heart of the story, it's really sort of a false prophet meets the chosen one, and the main characters in the story are a young man named Damus Alaric, who has the power of prophecy that his god of knowledge has bestowed upon him, and he manifests this power within his dream state, very much like Edgar Cayce, referring to sort of like the psychic from the mid last century. And his evil rival is a man named Grey Taurus the Mad, who once belonged to his sect, but had fallen from grace because he used the one relic. There's this magical book called the Tome of Enlightenment. He used it for personal gain, and that was that's like the number one commandment in their religion. And so his ancient or god punished him by stealing his sight and made him blind, and he comes back to take revenge. And of course he set his sights on the new rising star, in this case Damus. And so the two find each other in this crazy sort of dream state in the beginning, and then all hell breaks loose after that. And it's putting together sort of a really sort of Dungeons and Dragon-esque party of mixed people to fight the big bad evil guy. But ultimately I think I think fans of the genre will find it refreshing, because it's not the standard elf, dwarf, hobbit. You're not going to see much of that. There are elves in the novel, but I create monsters. They're all unique. There's some that are borrowed, but inspired is the word I would use to describe them from other more popular tropes that you'll see out there. But I have a great time creating it, and a standalone book became a series that I didn't expect, and it's been rolling ever since.
I love it when standalone books become series, and most of the time it's because you have built up a lot of fans who want more stories.
Yeah, and I've got lucky. I think when people read the first novel, I leave it a little bit of a cliffhanger, and I know that's some people love that, some people hate that. But when I wrote the first novel, it wasn't supposed to be anything except for the end. And my editor said, your book needs to end right here, and take this and push it into book 2. And then my publisher agreed with him, and now all of a sudden I've got a series. And what I learned, I don't want to say the hard way, but what I learned just learning a little bit more about authorship in the business is that readers in fantasy adventure novels, epic fantasy, dark fantasy, whatever it is, they expect series, standalone stuff where you spend so much time world building. It's a shame if you just let it go at the end. And folks get into the realm, and I've had requests for things like family trees and extra maps and glossary of terms and things like that I didn't necessarily even expect. And all of a sudden, I'm responding to readers, and you'll see a lot of those things. And I think it helps folks as they read and glance back and take a look, because the books are epic fantasy size. They're usually 140,000, 150,000 words, and 500 plus pages or close to it. So it's a thick read, but it's also one that immerses you in that realm. And I hope it gives sort of like a rich understanding of what you're walking into. And that's where I think this whole idea of taking it to a series came from.
What initially drew you to writing fantasy adventure stories?
I'll answer that in 2 ways, because they both kind of go hand in hand. The first was when I was in 4th or 5th grade. My English teacher took ill in like the May timeframe, and we had about 6 weeks left of school before summer break. And somehow, some way, the permanent sub that came in and replaced him, a guy named Mr. McKinley, I'll never forget him. Mr. McKinley got permission from the principal to just read us The Hobbit as our last 6 weeks. And it was like the idea was it's going to be this classic, and we had 50 minutes a day, and that led into Lord of the Rings, and we got partial way through that. And I went home and I told my uncle about it. My uncle was like a kind of a second father to me. He was paralyzed in the Vietnam War and former Marine, and he used that level of escapism. So he was a writer himself. So he was able to he did a lot of like pulp fiction and short stories for magazines at the time. And I grew up in my mother was his nurse. I grew up in his home for part of my formative years, and I just wanted to be an author because he was an author, right? And at the time I didn't realize it, but the two had kind of come together. And he bought me a Dungeons and Dragons set for Christmas that year, and my own copy of The Hobbit. And after that, that was it. That's exactly what I was going to write in the rest of my life. But in the beginning, you're like, oh, you're playing Dungeons and Dragons, you got all these great ideas, and so I was able to kind of memorialize a lot of those adventures that we had and put them into a story form. And I had 20 years to figure that out because I never thought I'd get to it. It was always one of those bucket list things. And then, I got to it, and it's been a lot of fun.
It seems like you're having a marvelous time doing something that you were destined at some point to do.
Well, I don't know about that. I would think that I am having a great time. I don't know if I've been destined to write it, but I'll tell you what, I've always wanted to. So once you get it out, it's hard to stop. And I think it's one of those things where if you love it, like I can't imagine a day now that I don't write, even if it's just an outline of the next chapter or something. It's always in the front of my mind, and it makes it easier for me when I sit down and start to really hash out. Like I'm right now starting to write book 4, and I've got book 3 in editing, and it's just I'm finishing book 3. You got all this energy, and you just want to dump it, and you don't want to stop and keep going. But then you have to wait for your editors to come back and tell you where you stink and how you got to change things, and the mistakes you made and what you pay them for, right? And and so I'm sitting on, I think that, and I just hope that it doesn't stop. I'm really enjoying it.
What do you find most challenging about writing these types of books?
Well, there's a few things, right? I mean, first of all, you're making everything up, right? I can't just say, Joe got in the car and drove down the street. Like I have to describe what the street looks like, what the surroundings look like, how Joe got down the street. Was it a horse-drawn carriage? Was it magic? What does the sky look like? Is there gravity? Is the sky blue? Like all those kind of things. And so there's a point where one of the challenges is planning, right? And the kind of stuff I write at the size in which I write it, all of these things eventually intersect. And so you need to know the history of the land. You need to know the history of its monetary system and how people transact and how commerce works, and even like a history of spellcasting and a history of monsters. It has to fit, and you just can't pick stuff out and hope it works. It's literally, in my case, it's a plan, because there's going to be more than just, there had to be stuff before and there's got to have to be stuff after. And this is what's happening right now in this little sliver. So I think a lot of it is really planning. And I think that fits me pretty well. I have a tendency to write backwards to forwards. So I'll write the end of the novels before I write the beginning, and then kind of stick all of the chapters in the right places, and then smooth them over and make it look like it's one piece, and it just came out of me. But that reverse engineering helps me keep that all in order, and therefore when stuff comes off the whiteboard, when I'm done, I know that I've baked it into the novels, and I think that helps me. So that's one part that I think is difficult. The other part is really kind of the authorship side. I mean, I'm not with one of the big 4 or 5, publishing houses. I've got a really small, genre specific publishing house. And so when you write a book, you think you just write it and you put it out there and it's out there and people buy it. It's not that way. It's its own business, right? So you have to treat it as such. And so I look at myself as, the brand, and my books are my product. And if I'm selling my product, how do I best move it? And you have to use resources at your disposal, like social media, places like this where we met on, various, podcasting platforms, radio, TV interviews. You have to go to conventions. You have to go to bookstores. You have to go to libraries. And if you want to be serious at it, that's the way that you're going to gain readership and folks that will follow you and wait for the next and the next. And you just have to be realistic about it, really. And so I try to look at it as, hey, this is my newest entrepreneurial venture. And, if I'm going to make this work, this is how it's going to work. Now, it's hard to match that when that's the science of it. But at the end, you have to respect the art. And there's part of me that doesn't care if I sell a single book. Just as one person enjoys it, it was worth the effort. But at the end of the day, for me to continue to write and do this, there's got to be some, profitability to it for me and the folks that are around me. So those are the things I find most difficult about it.
So I'm curious, since you're writing an extended series and you've built a world, how do you keep track of everything so it's consistent between the first book and the multiple books in the series?
Well, at one point I had a giant whiteboard in my den, and it was literally, it looked like I was a policeman tracking down a serial killer. Like, yeah, I had arrows coming to different places. It looked like a March Madness Sweet 16, all these brackets coming together, bringing 4 divergent storylines together. And then in there somewhere, you have to have growth of characters. You have to have, the thing, like you have to end it in the right places, and you've got to drop into it hints and foreshadowing. And some of that comes naturally. Others of that, it's really contrived. Like you know something, you read it back to yourself and something's missing, and you have to go find that and stick it in. So it's not easy. I don't know how I know there are folks in our business called pantsers, and they can just write by the seat of their pants. I am not that. If you told me to do that, like literally, I might freeze up. Like, I don't know what to do. Like if someone hey, here's a, you've got, here's 3 subjects, or here's 3 words, I'll go write something. I need to plan it anyway. So this really, I think, works well for my plotting kind of personality. So I don't mind it as much as I think others may. In fact, I use it as a tool to ensure that I don't miss anything.
So I'm a pantser, and one of the ways that pantsers get in trouble, especially in a series, is that, say, for example, you have a main character whose eyes are green in the first book, and then you forget because you're a pantser, and then in the third book they turn blue. Readers will notice that, and they will call you out for mistakes like that. So sometimes it's way better to be a plotter and to have everything planned out and to know your facts, because when you're on the other extreme as I am, you can get yourself in trouble.
Well, I agree with that, and I wish I had your talent. I mean, that's something that I honestly, I wish I could do and sit down. It is paralyzing to me if I don't know the direction that I'm writing. I have to know where I'm going, or else it just isn't going to make sense. It's almost like I don't have that talent. I respect people that do, but I will say this: you're right. It does help someone like me that has a very vast realm and all of this rich world building, or at least you hope it's rich world building, and you're hoping that you don't miss any of those details as you whittle it down. And even if it's just something as the names of characters' parents, or the name of a town somewhere, or any of those little things, and I think that planning really helps me keep everything in order.
What do you love most about writing in the fantasy genre?
Oh, the escapism, right? I think that the idea that I can tune out everything else that I do, and much of which I do in a day-to-day basis, is a serious thing. And I get to be something that I'm not, right? And I get to invest myself in this character or that character. And in this case too, a lot of these characters I'm introducing have been played. They were somebody's player character within a D&D, adventure, or they were a concept that was used by a dungeon master at some time, and they really scared me, or they really, it was entertaining to fight this kind of monster, or the plot was thickened. And I get this from my wife all the time. She teases me about the fact that we'll get together on holidays or picnics or whatever, and my friends, instead of getting around and talking about what's going on in real life, we'll talk about our most recent Dungeons and Dragons adventure. And they're like, you guys are just delusional. Like, this didn't really happen, but to everybody around that table or on that Skype, it did happen. So as weird as that is, but that gets me away from my day job, and I think I like that. The other side of that answer is, I do it. I love the entertainment value of it. Like I love when people read it, and I've gotten fan mail. I've gotten people that have been inspired enough to draw characters that, the characters I've described, and send me this stuff that I've used on my website, or I'll thank them for it. I'll ask them for permission to use that, or people that have asked to write fan fiction around it. And um, it sounds goofy. It really, really sounds goofy, but it's so humbling. And you're like, wow, like someone was motivated enough to take a character that they liked. And and I'll tell you the funniest story, and I've said this to a few folks, so it's not unique to your show, but I've had people come up to me and tell me what characters they want to live in, which ones they want to die, and or which ones they don't want to see die, and and compare them to Star Wars characters or characters from Lord of the Rings. And I find that exhilarating, and it's not only entertaining for them, but it's also entertaining for me. And then it makes you feel like you've written something that's stayed with somebody, and they cared enough to reach out to you on email or on social media and tell you what they think. And not all of it's good, but most of it's good.
So I'm curious, when a fan draws their depiction of a character as they see it, how close is it to how you might have imagined the character yourself?
Yeah, most of the time it's pretty straight on. I think that might be, I hope it's a function of good writing, because you want readers to imagine something scary in the way that scares them, as opposed to something that may scare me. And if you leave you don't want to describe them down to their knuckles or whatever, but in some cases it's pretty cool to go ahead and talk about this. Like I have one character that's the Antlered Man, and he's like basically a transformed, cursed guy, right? And he's got these antlers that pop out, and this like skeletal face, and he's like a kind of like a dead Sasquatch, basically, right? And that kind of thing. I've gotten 3 or 4 individual interpretations on it, and it is pretty straight on, and I really like that. Or some of the main characters, like I've gotten a few from Ritter or Princess Adeline, and and they take what you've written in their head, and it's, hey, I'll tell you what, I have always been of the fact, I heard one of my heroes in this business is a guy named R.A. Salvatore, and he writes the Dark Elf trilogy, and I've heard people ask him questions like, well, how do you pronounce this name? And his answer to them is, it's how you pronounce it in your head. Like, don't worry about how I pronounce it. How you pronounce it is that's your interpretation of it. So I don't care how whatever it rings in here is all I want. And I think that's true. But I do have to say that I've been impressed by a lot of that fan art is I look at that and I'm like, wow, that's really close to what I would think that the person looks like, or that creature would look like. So
that's fascinating to me, how you can transfer that knowledge to another human, because you're not transferring the actual artwork, you're transferring words. And so they're depicting it in their mind is similar way that you're depicting it in yours. So I find that very interesting.
Yeah. And this might be a little tangential, but I think that, my writing style would lend very well to a series of graphic novels. And I think that it's adaptable for that. Not the epic side of it. I mean, there's clearly enough content, but it's also something that's action packed. It's very illustrative. It's very rich in descriptions. And so, when you're, especially these days, graphic novels are really, they're so much more than comics used to be. And I think that, with the right partner, that might be something that we can work out of the Warminster series. I hope that's the case, because I think I get that all the time. It's like, hey, when is this becoming a comic? Or when do you see this, going? Because I think it does play very well to a visual medium, and it's not there right now. It's in this written form. And I'd love for someone that has that kind of talent to add their talent to it, to see what they can conjure out of that as well.
Do you have any tips for people who would like to write a novel but aren't sure where to start?
Yeah, sure. So I've got a few of those, right? I mean, the first thing is, if you've never written in the past, try to make it as much muscle memory as you can. And what I mean by that is, write every day. It doesn't have to be, a chapter or, anything major, but just outlining the next project, or finding a way that, you put some notes down, or a paragraph or two, to advance it on a day-to-day basis. And then you feel like the same way you feel like when you miss the gym. It's like, oh, I'm not there. My muscles feel like I'm fat now because I missed the gym for a day or two, or like I feel guilty for not. And I think that helps keep pace. The second thing is my trick is always from a planning perspective, it'll eliminate any kind of writer's block if you put down the plot, and you know where you're going to. You might not know what everybody says in every scene or what something looks like until you get there. But I think if you're writing towards something, or in my case, writing backward from something, I think that helps as well. And the third thing I would say is be open to constructive criticism. I think it's the hardest thing to do. But when I got my first edit back from my editors, I thought I had given them a near perfect script, like a manuscript. I really thought it was ready to go. And then you get that back and you're like, wow, I didn't realize how many, because you're so close to it, you lose the perspective on it, right? And you don't see not just the errors in, copy edits, but really holes in the plot where someone's like, well, what about this? Or what about that? And, I've always tried to bounce ideas off of my other friends that are creatives, that will take a look at it. Maybe not even, they might be, more of a horror novel fan, or maybe, they don't even read, but they're good. Like they might be artists of their own, or authors or poets or whatever it is, to get their opinion on it, because they're suffering through the same stuff I'm suffering through when it comes to things like writer's block, or in this case, editing. But you hear from your beta readers, you hear from those editors problems that you might not see. So look at it. I liken it to going to the dentist. You have to go. And when you get there, it's going to suck, right? They're going to cut your gums with floss. And even if you do floss, they're going to tell you it's not flossed enough. They're going to whiten your teeth. You're going to hear scraping. It's not going to be good. But when you leave there, you're going to feel refreshed, and your mouth is going to be pretty, and you're going to be able to smile, and you're going to walk out there and say, wow, this is as clean as I'm going to be. And that's what you want, right? So you want to put out the best product you can. And so it's okay to suffer through that. And I think you just learn from it. And there are mistakes that I will not make ever again, because I made those mistakes already. It makes those products closer and closer to the finish line every time I try to turn it into the next step of editing.
And I'm glad that you mentioned previously the importance of a developmental editor when you're first starting out, because I think that can help tremendously with development of a new writer and learning the craft.
Yep. And if, for those that may not know what a development editor is, there are several types of editors. There are editors, and they're usually the same person, but they could do it in different ways. A copy editor is someone who's looking for punctuation and spelling and sentence structure and formatting, and they're called a variety of other names: copy line, whatever it might be. Development editor is the step of editing that they are focusing exclusively on the story. And they want to know things that, as they're a first-time reader of it, that you might be missing because you are too close to it or too embedded, or there are things that you think you've written, but they're still rattling around in your head. You need to get them out and onto paper. So they will go back and look at it and say, I don't understand how this character fits in, or why is this person a point of view character, or how do these stories intersect, and when are they going to get there, because I'm waiting for it. And that helps you understand things like pacing, things like the dialogue, and or stuff you might have missed you need to get in there and fix. So it's a real big important step early on in the process to make sure that you're taking care of all of those plot holes.
I like to ask my writers, if you were having a dinner party, what 3 writers, living or dead, would you most want to invite?
All right, so that's this pretty easy one. So living is R.A. Salvatore. I mentioned him earlier only because he's written 4 Dungeons and Dragons and Wizards of the Coast. He's written about almost the same kind of stuff I'm writing, and he was given permission to do it within the rubrics of the game, right? So I'm a little jealous. He came well before my time and has been incredible at doing that. And so I'd love to pick his brain someday over a dinner party and ask him how he did, why he did, especially with some of the characters that are in there, which I think he's done an incredible job of developing into almost a nearly 40 book series, right? He's just has really blown the doors off of it. And the other 2 are dead. I mean, Tolkien, for the obvious reason, he's the granddaddy of them all. Without him, there would not be a fantasy adventure genre. I mean, he really brought it to the fore. It was popularized by him, and much that comes from it springs from Middle Earth in some way, shape, or form. And then the last one may be a little bit shocking, but Bram Stoker. I love, my favorite novel of all time isn't even fantasy. It's Dracula. And I think part of it is he is amazingly articulate in his detail. If you read Dracula, I think people will find certain aspects of it to be shocking, right? Like he took real life stuff, like living in the time of Jack the Ripper, or when a Russian schooner sailed into the port of Whitby and didn't have anybody on it. The ship, there was no one on the ship. He used those because they were scary. People knew about them. And so he put the vampire in him, you know what I mean? And so now in this time where people are looking over their shoulder because of Jack the Ripper, or looking to see why this ghost ship sailed into port, there are, he was able to take that and terrorize folks with it. But he also was a very sensual writer. He was very detailed. Like when you hear how he describes, the creature itself, or starvation, and some of the mental tortures that Jonathan Harker is going through, or even, the women, the Dracula's three wives, and how they kind of lustfully come in and start to try to take advantage of Harker. It's things that I'm assuming that back in the day would have been really racy. Like, I don't know how he got away with it, but he did. And I still think that, that kind of description, that rich dialogue, really pulls you into a novel, and you want to be there. At those points, I was Jonathan Harker, or I feel, for Wilhelmina Murray, and this connection she has by looking into Dracula's eyes. And I try to take some of those same principles and instill them into my work, because I want people walking away feeling the same way. Whether they do or not, I don't know, but that's not a bad. If you're going to aspire to something, you might as well be the best.
So what's ahead? What new projects are you currently working on?
Yeah, so I'm finishing the series. It will be 4-book series. The third book will be out here sometime in late winter, early spring. So I'm looking at a March release for the Trillius Gambit, book 3 in the Warminster Saga, and then book 4 will come out sometime mid to late summer and end the series, and that'll be called Echoes of Ghostwood. And then after that, it's a little to be determined. I've got some ideas. I've gotten interest to do another series with some of the main characters that are here. I've also gotten an interest in doing some prequel kind of stuff where it's more origin stories for some of the more popular characters. And I'm sure you as a writer get this too. You might have people tell you that their favorite character is someone you'd never expected to be their favorite character, and they want to know more about it. Like, where did Blue Connie come from? I've got this, like, he's basically a hobbit on steroids. He's like a gym rat, and he has a war dog, and he charges into battle and has this berserker rage like a barbarian, and attacks with 2 daggers and stuff. And I thought he was comic relief. And meanwhile, people love him. They're like, I want to know more about him. Or, the evil, assassin guy, they wanted to know more about, in Canis Truaith. And it's just, you don't expect it, but those stories are, can be rich and thick, and also add to the realm in a world building kind of way. And I'm thinking, if I'm going to do a new series, I'm not saying take a break from it. I'll start that, but I also think maybe smaller novella-ish kind of stuff that gives a background on some of the sexier characters, those that people like the most, that I've heard about the most, and kind of go a little deeper on those. And that way I can get them out and keep the momentum coming, and use that for the launch of the next series. At least that's what I hope. So I think that's the next step in the process.
So you're considering doing new series, but in the same world that you've already built?
Yeah, I think that's likely the way I'd like to go. In part, it's because I've spent enough time building it out that there are places that people haven't seen yet, right? And I want to explore those. And I know my readers are going to want me to explore some of those too. I reference them, or, I might, there might be someone talking about an area that's dangerous, and you're like, ooh, that sounds cool. What is that? And then you don't use it in this book because it takes away from the characters in the plot line. But I think you can build those out too. And I think that, looking at, what Martin's done, I'll just use that one now because people are really familiar with Game of Thrones. We're seeing prequels come from that, and it's basically set in the same setting, just a couple hundred years prior to, and that way you could continue to explore, Essos and Westeros, because there's always going to be much more to explore. In this case, it's a look back. Mine can be a look sideways. It could be a look forward. It can look back. I could be writing about in the same realm, using the same magic system and money system and maps and things like that, but I'm completely on the other side of the realm, writing a new story with new characters, with new monsters, but it belongs to Warminster. And I think that to me would be a lot of fun. Not that I wouldn't start and do something new, but there's so much unexplored here that I might as well keep it all together in the hopes that it grows into something and that's greater. And maybe one day I can let fan fiction happen and people can write their own stories of Warminster.
And where can listeners find out more about you?
Yeah, so that's pretty easy, right? So you could find me at jvhilliard, HILLIARD.com, which is my website, or you can also find my social media stuff. And if you have Twitter or Instagram or TikTok, you can find me at JV Hilliard Books. If you're on Facebook or Discord, you can find me at just JV Hilliard. And then my books are available pretty ubiquitously. You can find them on places like Amazon or Apple Books or iTunes. I've got an Audible book, so you can go, or audiobook, so you can go to Audible or any of the places where you would download that, and it's available on most platforms. So if you'd rather go into Barnes and Noble and get it, you can go in there. If you want to download it, listen to it in a car, you go to Audible or some other distributor, and you'll find it there. And of course, my publishing house is dragonmoonpress.com, which is the best place you can buy it, because we don't have to pay other people for helping sell it. So please, please visit dragonmoonpress.com.
And I will have a link to your website as well as to the first book in your series in the show notes.
Sounds great.
It was great to have you on the show, JV. Thank you so much for taking time to be a guest on the Curious Professor podcast.
It's been my pleasure, and thank you very much. I'd love to come back at some other time. We could talk about books 3 and 4.
And now for the answer to this episode's trivia question. When was the first Dungeons & Dragons set produced? The original edition of Dungeons & Dragons emerged in 1974. It comprised of 3 adventures, was hand-assembled, had a production budget of only $2,000, and sold out its 1,000-copy production run in just 11 months. We'll end the show with something punny. Why are dragons amazing musicians? They know their scales. Thank you for joining me for this episode of the Curious Professor podcast. If there's a person, place, artifact, or natural wonder that has sparked your curiosity and you'd like for me to feature it on the show, please let me know. My website is thecuriousprofessorpodcast.com. If you enjoyed the show, be sure to subscribe to the Curious Professor podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you'd like to become part of my community of curiosity seekers, be sure to visit my website, thecuriousprofessorpodcast.com, and join Dr. B's Hive. Until next time, always be learning and be curious with Dr. B.